Good morning. You're here on a Friday. I appreciate this dedication. Welcome to this Humanities Institute event, Crossing the Divide. I'm Ron Broglio, the director of the Institute. And the idea behind this is we can be reaching much larger publics. We know a lot, but we know it within a very narrow kind of field. Are we talking only to ourselves? And sometimes that's great. That's kind of a deep, textured scholarship. Other times people are like, what are the humanities? What are you doing behind those walls of academia? And kind of opening that up and providing a bit of transparency of what we do and telling people, well, have you heard of a thing called culture and history? Well, we do some stuff with that and letting folks know that. So we have a variety of folks here who are interested in everything from the Black Power movement to athletics to sandwiches, and the history of sandwiches. So I think we have a great variety of cultural items, let's say. So hopefully you'll hear what you need to in this and get motivated to write that book. We have with us Lisa Lucas, who's an arts administrator based in Brooklyn. Lucas has previously served as the Senior Vice President and publisher of Pantheon and Schocken books, the Executive Director of the National Book Foundation, the Publisher of Guernica Magazine, following many years in the nonprofit sector. She currently serves on the Board of Directors of the National Book Foundation and the National Council of Graywolf Books. And Kirby Kim, who represents both literary and commercial authors. He's most interested in manuscripts that straddle the fence a bit, with upmarket expression combined with genre elements or a plot device. When it comes to straight literary work, he's alternatively drawn to rich, sweeping stories that try to encompass a time or a place, or tightly written, narratively innovative stories or voices with award potential. He also represents a range of nonfiction works with leaders and journalists in the areas of science, culture, and current affairs, and he is known for representing pop culture, in particular music and comedy. So do we not deliver? Please welcome.
Thank you. Yeah. Is this your first time in Arizona, by the way?
No.
No, you've been here.
No. I've been in Arizona a lot of times.
Got it. This is a great time of
Good
year.
time.
Good time of year to be here. So I am going to start, and I live here. I'm a resident of the area. I think I'm the only agent in Arizona, so I'm representing. But I'm an agent, and I've been asked to kind of describe the role of being an agent and how we go about finding clients and how we get and oversee authors and their work. So I'm going to give you a little bit of bio just on myself and then talk about the job itself. So I was actually in law school in California, and you do find a fair number of lawyers in the agenting business, whether that's sports or whether that's as book agents. And I think a lot of it is because the law profession attracts people who don't know what they want to do, and they're kind of searching, but they love reading and they love stories. And so that's kind of the position I was in first year of law school, was realizing that I didn't want to practice law. I wanted to do something else with it. In large part, I wanted to be a part of a process and a creative process where I could point at something and say, I had a hand in making that. A lot of law is very transactional. It's just moving papers and money around and gripes and being compensated for your gripes and such. So I had remembered reading The World According to Garp and the role of, I think his name was John Wolfe in it. It was the agent of Garp. And even when I read that years before, I thought that seems like a really interesting job. And what I liked about it were a number of things. And I explained this because just to understand maybe some of the motivations of agents as they enter into it and as they do the position. I like the idea of kind of advocating for people who are creative, even if I wasn't a creative myself. I really love the idea of building equity in a client list. And so, especially in this day and age, thinking, oh, I could work for a company for 20 years and they could fire me, and where would I be, right? I'd have my knowledge and whatnot, but really there wouldn't be some kind of equity that I had. And so I like the idea of a client list that I could kind of build and work with for years and years and years, and no matter what happened, that list would still be with me, and I could take that with me. And also eventually, if that happened, I could potentially be self-employed. I could put up my own shingle and I'd be fine. Obviously, there was a lot of anxiety in my life about holding jobs. But the other thing that's great is that the job changes with you. It's not static. What I started doing 20 years ago, that's not what I do now, generally. And there are certain clients I've worked with who we've kind of grown together. Matt is a perfect example of that. I work with Matt Bell, just so you know. But I love that I can develop new interests and explore them in the context of the job itself. And then finally, what is wonderful and is still wonderful about the job, and maybe the best thing, is discovery. And being kind of that first set of eyes on somebody's work, and validating that, and letting them know that, within the context of all this other work that I see, there's something special here. And that's still one of the most rewarding parts of it. I always talk about actually the best part or moment of a job is right before I go on submission. That's when it's still our little secret. And I can't wait to tell people about it. Fortunately, once I do start telling people about it, that's when they start talking shit. But before that, it's all mine. So that's kind of how I got into the job. And my first position within agenting was working for a woman named Charlotte Sheedy. Charlotte Sheedy was known for working with Eve Ensler, a lot of brilliant narrative nonfiction, Mark Kurlansky, Laurie Garrett, but also children's books. She worked with Jackie Woodson. And so I got a really interesting exposure to different areas of publishing, wildly different. After a few months there, it didn't work out. She fired me.
Also notably, Ali Sheedy's mom.
Yes, Ali Sheedy's mom.
Which is fun fact.
Yeah. I never got to talk to her, unfortunately.
It's a bummer.
Yeah. But I worked for her for a bit, and it was a good first step. But then I worked for this other boss named David Vigliano, and Vigliano is a very controversial figure. He's kind of a shady guy. But what I did learn there was
the
VIG. He did a lot of high platform projects, and what I mean by high platform is celebrities and people who, whatever they did, it was musicians, celebrities, coaches, what have you. But whatever they did, they needed a writer, generally, to work with them. So I learned a lot about setting projects up in that capacity, collaborations. I also learned about especially for nonfiction, how important platform is. Why are people going to listen to you? Why would they buy a book from you personally? And you have to have certain things in place based on the different kinds of books you do. Narrative nonfiction is very different from prescriptive nonfiction. And prescriptive nonfiction, if you're going into health or something like that, you got to have an MD. Like that was kind of the rule. It's not totally true now, especially in this day and age, but it helps a lot. But chefs, trainers, what have you. It was really interesting. He was very entrepreneurial, but he was a nightmare to work for, and that is no secret. It's fine for Zoom to know that. But after a few years, I moved to Endeavor and WME, and what I did as I cultivated my own list was just try to figure out what it looked like. And a lot of lists look like a reflection of yourself in a certain way. I think of us as, in the agenting business, as kind of like independent record labels. So like I see myself as like Merge, right? Or like Sub Pop, a little cool, but still one eye on the commercial aspect of things. Whether that's true is up for debate. But that's how I try to see myself is I want a little bit of edge. I also want to sell books. And I would say that as I've gotten older, that that preoccupation has to kind of take some priority because of the position you end up in, your obligations and whatnot. When you're first starting out as an agent, there's very much a feeling of, I just want to sell stuff. I just want to, I see a sale here. I think I can make it work. And you learn how to sell books. So whatever the level is doesn't really matter as much. And so when you go to agents, if you go to different agents, I really highly recommend you diversify that list, because different agents at different stages in their career are looking for different things for their list, and their needs are very different. Now, because I have a full list, in order to justify taking on something else, it's a zero-sum game. All I have is my time, ultimately. Anytime I take something else, it really needs to be justified on a number of levels to take away from my existing clients, right? So the bar is way, way higher. And so that's kind of just the trajectory of kind of how a career develops as an agent. But a lot of times when we're looking at fiction in particular, it is very market-driven. It's more market-driven than it was when I was younger. When I was younger, I was just looking for fierce talent, right? And if you could write on the page, we'll figure it out. I had a lot more bandwidth to develop and work on material. Now, when I look at something at this age, it can't be just the talent. It can't just be like the line by line anymore. I really am quite conceptually driven. I have to think, okay, if I just in the abstract think of the log line, is this compelling? Is this something that makes someone, think, oh, that's different from what I've heard before. When it comes to genre in particular, I feel like that is generally about like moving a conversation forward. Right? And so that can be in terms of the context, that can be with the character, what have you. And so this is the kind of mindset I bring in with the fiction. And, not everything hits on every level, both on the line level, and that doesn't mean that everything has to be at a crazy level of writing. I think the particular story, the particular market dictates what you need from a specific kind of story. So when I work on really commercial fiction, I don't need beautiful descriptions of the trees. I need pace. I need escalation. I need something interesting, and I need a surprise, right? So I start there generally. When it comes to nonfiction, that's a very different process for me. A lot of times when it comes to nonfiction, I'll see something or read something and I'll think that person should write a book. And I'll give you one example. I watched this show called Abstract on Netflix, which was basically a docuseries about different designers in different disciplines. So the first one was Christoph Niemann, the illustrator from The New Yorker. One of the episodes, though, was about a woman named Kaz Holman, who is a toy designer. And the series, the episode about her, was as much biographical about her working and developing a perspective about toy design that was informed by her childhood as a young queer woman growing up in a kind of rural environment where all the toys that she was given told her who she was supposed to be. And so the things that she created as a toy designer were meant to be non-gender specific, and they were meant to promote free play and collaboration. And I didn't know what the book was at that moment, but I felt like she needed to do a book, right? And so I reached out to her, and we basically conceptualized something. I was like, what's the market? If you're gonna talk about play as it relates to kids, you have to be an MD. This is my thinking, at least. You know, is like, a lot of it is driven by the way that editors have turned down my projects in the past, right? So I'm thinking, if you're going to be talking about how you raise your kids, you don't have the qualifications for that. So what is it that we can find? Okay, let's speak to adults, right? Adults might like what you have to say. And when's the last time someone really talked about free play? I also think your job is fascinating. Let's talk about your job some, right? Let's talk about what it is to be a toy designer and what you do. And so we kind of built this project conceptually together, and we had certain markers that we used, like Sally Mann's book, Hold Still, and a few other things that talked about interesting jobs and how they approached them and how they did them. This also had a kind of idea aspect to it. So that's kind of the nonfiction part of things. It's a lot of conceptual work, it's a lot of conversations, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we often know exactly where we're going. We kind of figure it out through a combination of conversations in the market and what's working and kind of what has worked in the past and how you take the conversation forward. So I think I should probably stop there.
Okay.
I've been talking a lot.
No, it's delightful.
And hand it over to Lisa, because once we get that material together, I pitch it to her.
Well, in another life. But, so just to back it up a little bit, I am not a natural publisher, editor. I actually came into this world through a very sort of turny, windy path. I actually started as an arts educator many years ago in theater and in film. And I mention that because I'm not sure, you know, when I think about the marketplace, I think the ways that I began my career were about not responding and reacting to the marketplace and letting that dictate the work that I do, but also figuring out interventions inside of the marketplace. And so for me as a young person, I worked at Tribeca Film Institute, which was the nonprofit side of the festival. You would see how the programmers would program, and you would see who would come through the door. And then you realize that we weren't building an audience. And so the youth programs brought tens of thousands of kids to see films at Tribeca so that the kids of New York City actually knew that it existed, such that as they grew up and became ticket buyers, they would actually come back, remember the festival, and then we would have an opportunity to actually program differently, which I thought was actually like an interesting way to sort of say, okay, I can work within the frame of what there is, which is not necessarily equitable, fair, or interesting, or I can push not just through the content that goes through the curators who are always going to be the same until the system changes, but I'm going to change the audience, which then automatically gives some power to the audience, which actually means that we need curatorial innovation. So that was where I started my career. I ended up leaving film when I was 31, and I could not quite find a paying job in books, which is not an unusual experience for someone like me. And so what ended up happening is after going to a series of very depressing interviews, including with Vic, and everyone else in all of publishing who told me that I needed to go back and be an assistant at 31, even though I was the director of a large multi-million-dollar project in film, I volunteered for the Brooklyn Book Festival as curator. And I volunteered as the unpaid associate publisher of Guernica Magazine. And I spent 2.5 years before getting any compensation for that work, learning everyone, meeting everyone, and proving I wasn't an idiot, and that I did in fact read, perhaps more than everybody else did. Finally, I was able to turn Guernica into a job, and I think that Guernica and then the National Book Foundation, which is where it went next, were really, again, about external to the marketplace interventions. You know, a lot of the issue, even for agents, is discovery, right? You have an MFA system that's fairly broken. You have a media platform system that is fairly broken. And you have a lot of the same old coming up through all of those pipelines. And so Guernica was an opportunity to start readjusting a pipeline, a small pipeline, but a pipeline. And so I worked there because I was really interested in all the international work that was coming up, but like many organizations that had really, really good bones, that were super interested in international diversity and really uninterested in domestic diversity. And so I spent a lot of time trying to make sure that we were bringing in a lot more of that type of work, which was then, you know, one of the people that we notably published pre-publication was Kiesi Lehman, who nobody knew of at the time. He was trapped in a YA deal. They were trying to make his work more multicultural at the time, and we published a piece about how awful agent, editor, publisher had been to him. Kiesi at that point went back onto the marketplace and ended up getting the 2-book deal that gave us Heavy and a book that we're still waiting for, which is a campus novel, which was his first major deal. Which also the editor that acquired him managed to buy out his bad contracts from his other publisher because nobody would acquire Jasmine Ward or Kiesi Lehman back in those days. So they ended up in Chicago with a very, very, very small publisher. And they couldn't agent up, they couldn't get anybody. So this is in Kiesi didn't have an agent until 2013. And he couldn't find one. No, he was querying.
Yeah.
He could not get an agent.
Yeah.
So again, my interest was in sort of the corrections of the agenting, the editors, the magazines, the bookstores. There were failures from my eye on across the board. The awards, however, were a place where Jasmine, who had just come out of her deal with the small Chicago indie publisher, was a place where you could make some noise. And so when I ended up getting that job, I was really, really interested in making sure that the awards became more accessible. And I think a lot of people, when I first came in, were very unhappy, and they thought that I was going to make it dumber, which wasn't the point. The point was to put a big old megaphone on top of the books that were actually more diverse than what the marketplace would tell you that they were, that were coming up through those, and to actually get people to pick them up and pay attention and to do things like starting a translated literature prize. You know, obviously it's really great to celebrate translators and work from other countries, but that was also a dedicated marketplace intervention. What you had was a large number of indies with very little money who were publishing tons of translated works, and a complete divestment in translated works underneath a certain scope or scale within the corporate publishers. You also have to remember that at the time that all of this stuff is happening between 2010, you probably still had Workman Publishing, you probably still had Harper, HMH, you probably still had, Candlewick was still independent. You had a number of sort of robust independent publishers that still existed, that were able to take challenges, that were still interested in translated literature. But by the time I got to the National Book Foundation in 2016, you'd already seen consolidation really start to shut those down, and you'd seen the marketplace really pivot to what they knew would sell, right? And so depending on what the year is, you know, in 2020, what we knew would sell was something very different for that 1 year period of time. But over the course of it, you sort of see things going Colleen Hoover, right? Or you see a lot of black or brown dystopia, right? But not in other conventions, right? You just see a lot of sci-fi and people of color. And that becomes something that's easy to sell, and stayed easy to sell actually for a while, but it's not easy to sell like Puerto Rican literary, right? So it was interesting to sort of see that the foundation and the judges were really interested in innovation, and actually interested in sort of what their students or their, you know, communities were getting excited about. And so that was what I did. But then in 2020, there was something called Publishing Paid Me, where we learned that Jasmine Ward had struggled to get $100,000 for her second National Book Award winning book. And as I sat at the National Book Awards, it felt to me that I could not actually make real change, the kind of political, you know, marketplace too, because it's like about making sure that people have books that they actually want to buy, interventions, where I sat. And so at that point, lots of people's phones started ringing, June 2020. You pick up the phone, and I decided to go to Pantheon and Schocken. And now I'll just speak more specifically about what I did at Pantheon and Schocken. So Pantheon and Schocken are two roughly 80-year-old presses. Pantheon was started by a refugee from the Holocaust in Europe, and so was Schocken, which had been a German publisher, which is a publisher of Judaica. Pantheon was really a publisher of sort of, I don't know, gosh, the original translation of the I Ching, the Tin Drum, Marguerite Duras, Patrick Chamoiseau, incredible, Michel Foucault, lots of French history inside of the archives, but also Edward Said, who we're still reading today. So Pantheon was Edward Said's publisher. And then we became Art Spiegelman's publisher. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with Mouse or Persepolis by Marjane Satrapi. And we started publishing more and more graphic novels and more political work. It was very global, very literary, and very sort of high-end. When I came on, I think the idea was to sort of renew Pantheon and bring it into sort of the next generation and make sure that we were taking all of the excellence and the wonder of the years that had come before and really retrofitting that for a future audience, right? And so I worked with a team of editors. I was also an editor, and we looked at submissions. We looked at how those submissions fit into the work that we were doing and the slots that we had. And we figured out how to sort of make those books shine and sing. I think people think of publishing as an editor, and that's the one person you think of, but they don't really think of the paper or the binding or the shipping or the distribution or the jacket designer or the copy editor or the person who actually typesets the book or the publicist or the marketer or the managing editor, or the publisher themselves. What do they do? And so, as publisher, I oversaw a team of editors, and I sort of sideways oversaw the other functions that were existing, and then sales. Sales is something that you guys don't think about necessarily. And you basically, I always say writers make manuscripts and publishers make books. And the book for me is the sort of bound, positioned book with flap that tells you what it is, what category it is, that has an ISBN number on it so that somebody knows how to catalog it, that has a Library of Congress ID so that you know where to go. And that, to me, is a book. What I read before is a manuscript. Excellent, brilliant, undoable, can't make a book without one, right? But it's not a book yet. And so I think that we were just the bookmakers. Our relationship were agents. Agents would send you a submission. So you'd open up your email in the morning and if it's a nonfiction book, you'll see a proposal. If it's a fiction manuscript, you will likely see a full draft. And it comes with a pitch letter. And that, to me, is the beginning of the story that you tell as you work towards making a book, right? The pitch letter is the manuscript is the first part, then the pitch letter that the agent puts together, and then you start writing love letters to the team that you work with. I love this book. This is why I love this book. This is how much I think we should pay for this book. This is who I think will read this book. And it's usually really different from the more aspirational agent's note. We're bringing them back to, yes. Yes, your comps are usually much bigger than ours.
Yeah.
And comp is like the book a comp is basically a very question practice of sort of saying, this has worked in the marketplace, and so if I publish this book, this is how much this book will likely sell. But it is only based on what has actually been published into the marketplace, and it's only based on how things have been sold. And so, every book that becomes a comp didn't have a comp, is what I like to say. Art Spiegelman's Mouse is a great comp, right, for lots of things, but there was no comp for a book about the Holocaust starring cats and mice. And there was no graphic novel before Mouse, and so there was no comp. I think The Power Broker is another great book where there's no comp, right? A sort of minorly famous person that ends up being a 50-year doorstop, sort of award-winning 5-time, Pulitzer-winning author, right? There's no such thing. So comps are sort of questioned. And so anyway, what we would do is we would ultimately tell this story and see if everybody else on your team is interested in taking this journey with you to make this book. Then you go back to the editor or the agent and see if they're willing to accept the terms, and you negotiate. And then you acquire the book, and then you get to work. And then, anywhere between 9 months and God knows how many years later, more often, you have something that's out in the marketplace. But in that work, you're also sort of having lots of conversations with everybody about what does work, what is the marketplace. For me, I've always been very political, right? Like I'm not the kind of person that goes into a system and just sort of says, oh, this is how it works, cool, let's do that. For me, it was always sort of like, well, why don't these books sell? What are we doing? What could we be doing? What investments could we be making? What happens if we do take a chance on something that we traditionally don't take chances on, right? What if we actually put pressure on this retailer? And so that's kind of like in a nutshell. As editor, it was a very different role. That was like another hat that I wore. And then you really just get to be kind of like purely interested. I was not necessarily, some editors are all about like the almighty dollar. Like some editors are money makers. They're like gonna find you Colleen Hoover and they're gonna make you money. I was always more interested in the backlist because that's where 70% of the money in publishing comes from. Not the front, but the back. And so for me, making good bets that paid off modestly, that were gonna pay off for you forever and ever and ever, always felt like better business. So I got to be really pure about it. Some of the books that I published were Helen Garner. I don't know if you've read any of her books that have just been coming out over the past little while. Laura Worrell's Sweet, Soft, Plenty Rhythm. I edited Sylvia Molnar, who lives in Texas, The Nursery, and a few other things. But, that was really the job. And that is what my experience of all that has been.
Yeah. Maybe we should talk a little bit about acquisitions in that
Sure.
process, because it's really, I find that when I'm in these settings, that part of the process is really one that a lot of writers are interested in and have questions about.
And I think a lot of people don't understand how acquisitions really happen in general. Even sometimes you'll talk to an agent and they don't understand that you're not the one signing off. So in consolidated publishing, right, in the new way, you have anything over a certain threshold is the decision is going to be made by the company that owns you. Underneath that, it's going to be the CEO of your company. Underneath that, it's going to be not you, not the editor, not the publisher, but the president of your group. Then underneath a certain threshold, it is the publisher. So acquisitionally, it all depends on how much money something is going to cost. Who makes the decision whether or not you can acquire it?
Right.
And I think that that's something that people really don't understand. In the past, the publisher was the person who did it. That is almost really no longer.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, before...
even before I made decisions, I had a finance person that reviewed every single P&L that I looked at for the whole time that I worked.
Right, and P&Ls are profit and loss statements.
Yes.
That, everybody has different, I guess, an alchemy around that, like how
it's basically so
project it.
it's like a P&L is like how much money am I spending and how do I make it back and what are all the detail of the costs and the details of the earnings, right? So it's like in a P&L at a publisher, you're looking at how much does the paper cost, how much is the advance, how much am I spending on marketing, how much is it going to cost to ship it, print it, reprint it, how many do I think I'm going to sell, and it also spans out over 10 years. Or 4 years, depending on how you set up the P&L. So you're not just looking at like how much money am I going to make this week because books are slow. You're looking at how much you're going to make over 4 years.
Right.
Which is interesting because like I never got to see the end of any of my P&Ls because I worked there for 3 years and 4 months.
But that's also where comps come in.
Yeah, and the comps are where you get your numbers. So if I say I'm going to publish Nana Kwame Adjei-Brenyah's Chain Gang All-Stars, I'm going to figure out what books feel like that book and see what units they kicked off in the marketplace. Did they sell 100,000? Did they sell 300,000? And then you're going to put it on the thing and determine what your number is. So, your target unit sold is where you derive, and the price of the actual book, right? If I'm going to sell 100,000 copies at $32 a copy, then that gives me my baseline number, and then I'm looking at how to get there to that 100,000 copies, and I'm looking at all the costs that are going to detract from the profits that I'm going to make.
Right. And what were your restrictions on comps? Because when I talk to some people, it's your comps have to be within the last 3 years.
I think that's proprietary, so I'm not sure I can say, but there's like definitely people want them to be recent. They want them to be, they want them to be, not emotional. They want them to be practical in some way. I mostly find that people just like, the problem with comps are that it's just like somebody just says, I don't believe you. I don't believe that comp. And you're like, but you're just a fucking person like I am. What does that mean?
Yes, it's true.
Like you're literally just a person saying that, like, so, you know, you get it, like, so it's just, it's like comps are not scientific on any level.
Yeah, absolutely not.
And like whether or not you're told to take a comp out or not is like just down to like somebody being like, that's a bad comp.
Yeah, yeah,
Why?
yeah.
You know, and then you also have to assume that like half of the people that you're working with haven't read half of the things that you've read. So they're just like based on having not read a book and having heard of it.
Sure.
And like knowing some glancing information about sort of how it was sold. They're like, well, that's a bad comp, which I always found just sort of like shockingly unprofessional.
Nobody ever told me I had a bad comp, because that's the nice thing about being, you know, like a solo person, not having to talk about them really. But, you know, I think when I think about comps, a lot of times I just think about elements of the comp books as opposed to this is going to have the success of that comp, you know. But
that's what he's called emotional comps, right? Like
right,
it's like
exactly.
I'd be like, this is like, you know, it's like if you want to, you know, you don't want to say like, oh my God, this book is like the yellow wallpaper, but you're not going to use the yellow wallpaper as a comp because it's 100,000 years old, and, you know, it's taught in schools, you know.
Yeah.
The important thing about comps though too is like, there is a more scientific way to look at it. It is like, well, how much of that came from academic? And does this book actually have an opportunity to be picked up by colleges all around the country, right? That is like a material difference between like why you wouldn't use Comp Mouse to a Marvel comic, right? Because the reality is that most of, or vice versa, you know, the way that people buy those books are very different. And a lot of it is coming from schools.
Absolutely. And there's also a distinction, a huge distinction in terms of the reliability of comps when it comes to fiction and nonfiction, right? With nonfiction, I think you can look at platform, you can look at certain metrics, you can look at where the conversation is and say like, this is like legitimately a progression on that, and that market is pretty solidly like there, like for business books, for instance.
Business books more, but celebrity is very
Celebrity is tricky.
uneven. You know, I mean, I think there was a great moment in 2008 where Twitter was king and people were moving units, you know, that way. But it's like, I think even people with platforms are having a hard time moving things these days because the platforms keep moving.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. There is that for sure. One of the things we were asked to talk a little bit about is kind of the academic versus trade publishing world, and I just want to touch on that real quick because I think the distinction that I generally draw, and my colleagues and I talk about when we bring people from the academic world to the trade market, you know, the stuff that seems to work in the trade market in my experience at least, has been where there is more of a narrative kind of flair to it, more of kind of like a traditional narrative structure to something. And what I find with academics oftentimes is the lack of that structure, the lack of that kind of idea of an arc within it, as opposed to here's information, here is what you need to know everything about a certain topic.
Who's reading like an academic book? Or you're just saying I am?
I am.
Right, but why are you? What do you do, and why are you reading one?
I'm a student. I think it's interesting. Sometimes I take literary theories and I'm like, oh, what interesting things can I make out of that?
Right, the initiated, right? You're the group that you're learning. You're a learner, and academics are writing books to teach you, and to further enrich your education. A lay reader is not interested in all that. A lay reader doesn't have the bedrock of understanding. They haven't read the 5 books you need to read to understand, blah, 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 blah. You know what I mean? They haven't done all of that work. And so, you know, it's like, it's audience. Like, yes, absolutely narrative arc and all that, but like, who are you writing to? An academic book is for scholastic utility. A trade book is for a lay reader. And so if you're gonna, like, if you spoke to somebody, like, let's say, Matt, you want to talk about fiction, and you're just at like some bar in Cincinnati with some random dude, and he doesn't know nothing about books, and you talk to him like you talk to me about books, how's the conversation gonna go?
Oh no, we just rock on football instead.
Yes, right? But there's a way for you to get that person excited about fiction and about writing, and that's the difference. You're having a conversation with a dude in a bar who doesn't give a damn about the thing that you're interested in, except for tangentially. and you have to give them a road. You know, you have to hold their hand through it. That doesn't mean dumb. It just means speaking in a different way. You can be just as smart.
Yeah, and usually I think it comes down to character, right? Usually I'm looking for like a character to give a spine to whatever story. So that's always where it starts for me when I'm talking to academics and trying to like relate something historical, what have you. You know, we'll find a compelling character and then we'll build off of that, really, and try to create something that resembles, you know, a story, you know, and that for me has worked in terms of approaching and talking about these things. Sometimes it's a number of characters too. I mean, like if you think about like David McCullough in like, you know, 1776, like that reads like an ensemble thriller almost. It's not one character, but it's a number that he keeps kind of zooming in and zooming out from. So that that is generally what we're looking at. And sometimes you have to let go of some of that rigor, some of that academic rigor of like, well, if I go here, then I got to talk about this and this and this, and it doesn't really serve the narrative as much, right? So we've got to keep the readability of it, the pace of it. So certain things get kind of, you know, you lose some things.
I'm going to challenge the
along
rigor
way.
part, but the power broker is where I feel like that shows up. Like it's like that is a book that has characters. At one point, 100 miles or 100, maybe it's like a 3-mile stretch of a highway becomes a character. You know, but it's like, but by turning that stretch of highway into a character, you lose none of the rigor of talking about how roads are built. You lose none of the rigor of talking about all these things. It's just about style and craft. You know, so I think that there is a way to use craft to sort of write it, but I didn't mean to interrupt, but I just, one thing about the sort of trade versus academic, you know, I think one of the places where we've seen a lot of movement, and I guess I over-index for black stuff, but you know, you look at Ibram X. Kendi, right? Whether you like him or not, Stamped from the beginning, right? No, I mean, people have all sorts of feelings about all sorts of people. Stamped from the Beginning was an academic book that was born out of it was published by Public Affairs or The Nation Books. It was not published by sort of a big 5 publisher. And it was really a book about 5 texts that changed the way that we looked at race in America, right? That was kind of the frame, or 6 texts, but it was about how we codified racism looking at specific texts. That was a very academic book. It won the National Book Award. It launched him into stardom, and it was the bedrock for how to be an anti-racist. In many ways, it's the same book. He's the same dude, making the same points. But that's his pivot from academic to trade. You know, I think you look at people like Imani Perry, who comes out of Princeton, who's doing a lot of, you know, you look at Saida Hartman, you look at, what's her name? Dionne Brand, Christina Sharp, which is like really dense, but you know, but as they're writing more, they're moving from deeply academic into something that is, as the world changes, into something that's a lot more, and to great success. You know, winning all the awards, actually selling books on things that are very, very difficult without sacrificing a drop of rigor. How to Be an Anti-Racist may have been a little more cynical than Stamped from the Beginning. But, you know, so for me that feels like, you know, you know, it's like I think also when you think about academic writing, a lot of writing about Indigenous people, about queer writing, about queer life, about, you know, sort of like East Asian studies, about Black life, about, you know what I mean, about food was buried in academia because nobody thought that these were things that we cared about. So ultimately, I think it's just about sort of a mild pivot of sort of your gaze, you know, but remembering that these things are important to everyone, and you just have to say it to them the way. But people aren't stupid is the thing. Even the dumbest person you know isn't stupid. They're not, you know. So it's like I've always been a real fan of making sure that you know, kind of retain the brilliance of the thinking, which is why people will come to you. But just figure out what that packaging is and what the come hither is. But also I think that publishers need to be braver about smart things. The number of times that publishers have actually published, you know, and been surprised by some little thing that they published that went gangbusters is legion.
Yeah, I mean, Yeah, I mean, look, like some of my, a lot of my opinions are formed by those frustrations for sure. And I think that that's one of those things. Look, they're so busy. Editors are so overwhelmed and swamped that I find with certain things, it's fiction or nonfiction, frankly, it's just so much easier to check out. It's just so much easier to say no. I have, you know, a number of books where, you know, a writer is doing something innovative and different formically, you know, and it's not experimental, you know, it's not at all, but you have to pay attention and you have to get to the end. And they don't have that bandwidth, you know? And if they sit there and they're thinking, well, I'm 100 pages in and I'm just not there yet, well then, like, what about your general lay reader, right? They're even worse, right? And to some extent, but you still have to feed them. You have to challenge them. You have to show them that this exists and this is the kind of narrative that we can make. And so, look, like, I will admit that we get a little gun shy on certain things because what we're going out with, you know, I mean, now I'm a lot hardened to it, but rejection is such a huge part of this game on all sides, on your side, on our side, on their side. They feel it from the market, and they have the most
Or
at
from
stake,
your job.
right? They have the most at stake, right? And I have much less, but I do have my time, right? And I sit there and I take away from my other clients, and I go out there and we go out to 25 people, maybe 40 sometimes. It can go and go, but when you're getting rejection after rejection, you just start getting kind of in this place. Well, you know, I guess this isn't what's working out there. This is not what they want, and so you just start recalibrating a little bit, like what is getting purchased. And unfortunately, there is that element of everything gravitates towards this mean, right? Both what Lisa was saying is that, like, you know, we should be braver about smarter things, right? I will say that we probably need to learn how to do the less smart things too. We get taught a lot of lessons by people outside of publishing about what the market wants too. It's interesting that we all fall within this, but I don't even know what point I was making, but I was just riffing off of, like, the idea of you know, how we make those decisions and the challenges that come with, like, you know, pursuing projects and trying to get them.
When was the last time that the book marketplace grew?
Audio, right?
No,
Just
audio is a piece,
technology-wise.
but I mean the whole.
I mean,
it's-
romantasy is like one thing, right?
Yeah, but you're losing ground every time one of those things grows. So it's like, in terms of the actual market, continues to contract and contract and contract, but different. It's like it's all one pie. The pie never gets bigger, at least not lately. Different SWAT. You know, this is what audio is. This is what audio is now. This is what audio is now. That changes. Romantasy taking over, but literary fiction collapsed.
Children's might be where it did. Not now, but like back in the day.
My point is that you're dealing
is
with
what
an
I mean.
anti-innovation industry. That's my point. Apple's growing. Tech is growing. Clothing's growing. Video games are growing. What other industries? Name some. They're all growing, not books. Not books. So I'd argue that, you know, it's like, I think that it's important to actually take a look at why people are not interested in what we're selling, and then we just more and more get entrenched in the stuff that we know will move so that we can eat dinner. And I think that's difficult for books. So, I mean, my advice to people writing is to just stay brave. And don't minimize yourself in your work, because it's just going to make the literal world worse. Which is not everybody's favorite thing to hear. But it's like, but good work is good work, and it'll keep standing up. It always shows its way. You know, I mean, poor Octavia Butler took her how many years? But she did it. She made it on that bestseller list just like she said she would. And it doesn't do us any good to minimize ourselves and our thoughts, and especially not in a world that's as challenged as the one that we're living in right now. I think books are a huge part of that, but I think that as consumers, so forget about as writers, as readers, you know, as consumers, you have power, right? I mean, when was the last time you bought a book? Not for school. Last week, everybody? A book? Did you buy it online or in a brick and mortar store? It's okay, we're in safe space. Do we have some Amazon shoppers?
I'm good at changing hands when I can.
But we have some Amazon shoppers. I bought stuff at Amazon, right? 70% of the marketplace. Now that changes everything. Why? Because it's all algorithm. There's no advertising. Do you know what I mean? There's no I set up a thing in the front. There's just it's all algorithm, right? So the more you buy, the more you help change that number, the more you convince other people. So I think actually the advocacy of it all is really about consumer behavior. You know, it's like you look at Target, right? Target divests from blah, 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 blah. Well, that's going to change the books you see, which is going to change the huge buy. You go into Barnes & Noble and you don't see any books that you actually think are interesting.
Yeah.
That's a huge part of the marketplace. You know, there's not much you can do about Amazon except not shop there. So, I mean, I just think that is an interesting thing to think about. But I think people who are writing don't think about the business of writing. You know, at the end of the day, it is a consumer product. Nobody likes to hear that. But it's like if I write a book and I put a price tag on it, I'm trying to sell it to you. And you as a writer are trying to sell somebody a book. It's a transmission of an idea. There's a dollar attached to it, but it's the same thing. So thinking about the business of moving things from point A to point B, as much as you think of the business of getting your name on a book that's in a store, right, is part of the job. And so I'm not just like saying this to just be like, blah, 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 this is my politic, but it's like, but we need to be holistically interested in the business of books. Because we're not doing super great right now. And that's on all of us. The more we hold hands and do that, the better opportunities we'll have to publish our books and have them well read by the people in our communities that we want to be reading them. So it is a broad, hard to implement thought, but it is something that I think should be the bedrock of every writer, you know, and what they're thinking about as they sort of enter into this marketplace or as they navigate the marketplace, because it's of the utmost importance, you know. Where we buy things, how we buy them, what we will accept and what we won't. Changes my behavior, your behavior, and the powers that be behavior. And it takes a lot less than you think. If you could get 1,000 people to buy a book week one, just 1,000 people to buy a book, one single book, that's a huge change. And so I think people think that these books are selling hundreds of thousands of copies. You know, I had a book that, I'm not even going to tell you what book it is, but it was a book that was a big book, no more than 100,000 copies. And you thought it was huge. If I told you the name of the book, you'd be like, that was a big old book. That person succeeded. 100,000 out of 325 million Americans. If you get somebody to buy 2,000 copies of a book, it matters. That's where we're at. Comps are like looking like 20K. 30K units moved. Out of 325 million Americans. These are small, there's room to change it all. You're dealing with such small margins, you can change it all. But you gotta actually be aware of what's happening. So again, not to get all, but that to me is the sort of most interesting things about book, because it's shrunk so much, except for, again, the Colleen Hoovers or the John Grishams or the, you know, celebrity memoir, Beyonce's mom did a book, whatever, those things, Prince Harry. Take all of that and put that on the side. That's just gonna do what it does. Romantasy, sure. Romance readers read 5 books a week. You know, good. You're not gonna change that stuff. But for the rest of it, when you're art comping at 20,000, there's room for change. It's just about discovery and about our consumer habits and about pressuring people to sell things well. And I think that is a really important thing to remember, because it's easy to feel powerless. 20,000, you think about all those people that get 20,000 people on a petition. That's how easy it is to change some of this stuff, but we don't know that we can actually make a difference. If everybody just bum rushed their local bookstore and bought every copy, that's a reorder. And then somebody sees that there's a reorder in that place, and then they send the author down to go do something. And then everybody in the community buys it, and you can do it again. And it's not big numbers, but it's change and it's movement. So I think people have to get real grassrootsy about this stuff. And I think the way that we have been doing it is, as far as I can tell, very broken.
maybe this is a good time to open it up
Yeah, yeah,
for
yeah.
some
So,
questions.
and there
Sorry,
are
I-
a few things,
all the
so
spicy
I'm gonna-
things.
And I'm going to direct a few things because this is really good. One is on, folks are like, how do I find an agent?
Yeah.
That kind of like really basic kind of stuff.
Yeah.
A lot of academics, if you sell 1,000 books
Mm-hmm.
of your like, British landscape aesthetics.
Yeah.
I mean, it's, that's
Yeah.
a big deal, right?
Right.
So, the whole thing of like, what are you looking for in terms of a track record of, have you published in the Atlantic? Did you publish here or there? Do you have some other stuff to show that you can do the thing? And then on the other end, after oftentimes in academics, you publish your book, you're done, you're off, I've got tenure, I'm off to the next thing, whatever. But in trade, you're halfway through your job. The other job part is selling the book, getting out there and making it happen.
Yes.
And so that's that other element that you're talking about,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
kind of drumming up some business, getting on the social medias, doing the bookstore routes, all that to kind of make that happen.
Well,
So
why don't-
helping people with that.
Why don't I talk a little bit about finding an agent
Yep.
and then the selling part and how that
Yeah.
you guys become part of that process is probably much better handled by Lisa. I mean, on my end, in terms of like how I find people is a lot of times through the pieces that they write, their own writing. So writing, begets more writing in a certain sense. So, I'll find based on the publications I read, and they're generally general trade publications. So, the Atlantic or what have you, Wired or based on what I represent. And if you're doing fiction, then there's a lot of short stories, Guernica essays also. We'll look for talent that way, but for the nonfiction that I do, a lot of times it's very concept based. So I'm looking for kind of newsy kind of material. So I'll go there, and a lot of times I will reach out or an editor will reach out. So trying to get exposure and place pieces that are based on your academic kind of research and such, that can be its own magnet for interest. So I would really highly recommend that you work on a number of parallel tracks when you're trying to publish a book. So doing that while at the same time, potentially crafting some kind of proposal maybe. And, proposals generally look a certain way when you do it paint by numbers. There's an overview of a few pages, that's kind of your pitch. You go into potentially the market and what the market is for it, your bio, an annotated table of contents, and maybe some sample material, right? So 3 sample chapters or what have you. But we break those rules often and frequently based on what the project needs, So like, for instance, I have this writer who is wanting to write a memoir about his friend who is really dealing with ALS. It's been 3 years, this battle, and kind of, it's a very emotional, very on the line kind of project. And I was just like, throw all that stuff out the window and just write 30 pages about like your relationship and, go in and out of some scenes and kind of just tell the editor like what you want to do, what you want to accomplish with it. None of those things exist in this project, in this proposal that we're working on, right? And that's inspired by actually J.R. Moringer's Tender Bar proposal, which was more in that vein. So these things look very different. And I wouldn't say that in order to approach an agent, you need to have something that looks like this cookie cutter, like Bob Ross like type proposal thing to go to them. You might even go and say, look, I have this idea for a project. Here's my credentials. Here's some of my writing. Would you be interested in working with me? I think that's a way that you can go about doing it. In terms of finding an agent and the right agent, that's also another question we often get a lot. And the places that I suggest are generally your own stacks of books and, looking in the acknowledgments and seeing who's doing the kind of projects in the books that you admire yourself. You have the advantage, if you have that book and you've read it, to be able to approach that agent and say earnestly and honestly, like, I'm reaching out to you because I love this book that you worked on. And then there are databases and places you can go. So Poets and Writers is a place with a lot of kind of descriptions of agents and what they do. There's also Publishers Marketplace, which is $25 a month, I believe, to get a membership, but you can go on there and see the deals that agents are doing. A lot of them are announced there. A lot of times, most of the time, I get stuff through referral at this point. So building a network and asking people and talking about your book, and other people who have agents, they might refer you to their agent. And I think a lot of times, just as in the real world, that's how a lot of people find those connections too. So those are a number of methods. And then in terms of what you need in hand, that's what I wanted to kind of suggest.
I'd also follow a lot of them on social media. No, don't interact overly, but follow, because a lot of them will announce, my submissions are open. I'm taking open submissions, and I think that's always, Sarah Boland always does that, which I think is really incredible, because it's like so much of it does become referral. And if you feel like you're somewhere in the boondocks and you don't know anybody, it's like, oh, well, I guess just, oops, can't get an agent, I think AWP is actually it's more of a fiction marketplace, but I think that increasingly Folio does an event, Avitas does one, a few people will go. I think places like Breadloaf, places like, they have the environmental workshop, and I think they have a nonfiction one, but it's like going to Breadloaf, going to Tin House. I feel like a lot of agents make the effort to actually go and meet writers on the ground there, which I think is a really important way. Again, there's costs associated with doing those programs and time, but they're incredible places to actually connect directly with an agent. And I've seen lots of really, really pleasant stories. And I've, as an editor, would go and meet people and connect, the writer to an agent in some of those scenarios. So I definitely think that that's a really good way to think about it as well. But of course, poets, writers, and all that. But,
Yeah, those are it's an investment, right?
Sure. But again, if you don't have any money, I know for a fact Breadloaf does free stuff, and so does Tin House. It's there's both opportunities to have fully paid for experiences at both of those places. So it's not 100%. If you were to go to Disquiet in Portugal, that's pay to play completely. Yeah. There is no scholarship mechanism there.
Yeah. But I just mean that the investment can be you'll get a lot from it. If you take that step, and it's rejuvenating, being around community, making new contacts, understanding what this looks like. I go a lot of times just to get that energy too. I wake up every day and I'm in my athleisure and I sit in my home office and I'm pretty isolated. So I seek out community, and when I go, I really enjoy that part of it. But
and panels. Every time there's an agent doing a panel, go. You'll get a chance to meet the agent. Do you know what I mean? And have a conversation.
Unfortunately, it's a lot of me here, so you'll hear the same thing. So maybe annually I'll change my shtick. But yeah, what else should we talk about?
But the selling, the other part was talking about selling, and then we can go to
selling.
questions really quickly. But it's I think that selling is changing rapidly, right? The way that we present ourselves, package ourselves. Was it Twitter? Was it TikTok? Was it what's next? Is it Substack? I think the thing is find your people. Find your people digitally. Find your people in real life, and stay with those people. And continue to build relationships with those people around the stuff that you're interested in. If it's a bunch of medievalists, great. If it's, I was thinking about Dr. Ashley Farmer, who is an academic down at, she didn't get to publish Queen Mother Audley Moore, but it's coming. But she was one of my authors, and she became sort of well known as just a historian who was interested in Black women in the archives, and she built up a whole group of people who were just interested in Black historians. And that was on Twitter largely, and she had a trade book that an academic book that did very, very well for what it was, because there was this community of people who were really interested in what she was doing. And you grow that into a platform where you can sell the book in a different way. So, I think there's just lots of different ways to do it. But I think that people would love it for selling to be like, I just put the book into the world and it sold itself. And I don't, I think that we think it changed. I'm not sure it ever did. It's always been a hustle. It's always and forever been a hustle. It just looked different. There was never a moment where you put a piece of art into the world and you didn't have to hustle for it. The internet just made it feel different.
It is a hustle.
It's always been a hustle.
Yeah.
Always. Always. You read The Portrait of Dorian Gray and it was a hustle.
Yeah.
It's Oscar Wilde. I mean, it's always been a hustle. You'll never get to sell a piece of work well without working for it. So just do the work. And don't feel like it is not a necessary part of the job.
Yeah.
That's my best thing, is like anybody who thinks that not having to get up there and stump for the thing that you're selling is wrong.
Yeah. But that's a good point, going back to the idea of community, right? And going and being out there. Like when I have a writer who is done with a book, I'm telling them two things. One is work on the next book before the other book comes out. Just like get as much as you can done, because once your book comes out, there are so many factors that you can't control, whether it's a huge success or whether it bombs. Like it's going to be emotionally really hard to focus on creating new work. So just keep working, right? Don't make that something that you constantly do. But then also just get out. Just go out and meet people and be social. Go to the parties, if you're in New York or whatever, and you just don't know where a conversation will lead, right? For me, when I'm pushing a book, I'm constantly trying to get a hold of magazine editors and reviewers and trying to get some piece of media, some way to get the word out, because the ecosystem is tiny in terms of, getting word out. Like one of the hugest things I can get is the AP, a review in the AP, because it's a magnifying effect, because so many local markets, take that and put it in their local papers. But the review community is tiny right now. So I'm always looking to barter and trade favors on this end, and I gather them, and I try to help people out earnestly, but I'm also thinking I'm going to you for a blurb later. I'm going to ask, and if you're too busy, that's fine. But I am going to come back and go to you. It sounds a little depressing to be that transactional, and so I get to do that, but you also have to think a little bit of being savvy, I think, as a writer, and just be able to hustle. And there's a way to do it earnestly. I don't think you need to be like gross, I think a lot of times these things naturally happen when you're just out in the community and looking to be a good literary citizen. The best literary citizen is sitting right there.
It's actually so much less
Absolutely.
gross in books than it is in art. Open studios with rich people that you're trying to sell the thing, and you're trying to. I mean, it's like I don't think that book people realize how much easier it is than having to like dance for funding in film, or having to show something to a collector who thinks that you're a dirtbag.
Yeah.
Or like every other medium, or having to dance for someone literally.
Oh yeah, we're
To make,
in the
it's like
nonprofit world,
literally
right?
literally
it's so
books.
horrible.
It's like it is so much less gnarly. Yeah. As much as we scream about how nasty our business is, it's the most polite business we've got.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
I just think we got to do our jobs.
Yeah. Yeah.
Questions?
Thanks, this has been really lovely. I'm curious, can you say anything more about academic presses that have like multi-tiers? So for example, last time I talked to University of California Press, they told me they have their traditional academic line, they have a hybrid line, and then they have their like public-facing line.
A lot of them are structured like it's hard to say because they're not like those are internal brands and not like so you don't go to the bookstore and like know that this is from UC Irvine's.
Yeah, I guess
So it's an internal rubric, just like I might say I'm at Pantheon and I do graphic novels and some upmarket fiction, but mostly literary fiction. You'll never know the difference because it's like a book is just a book. Most of the bigger presses, Yale University Press, North Carolina University Press, UT University Press, there's a few of them that are just big enough that they can do larger numbers of books.
So as a writer, what would the experience be like doing an academic press in their like public line as opposed to a trade press?
It'll be different at all 5 of those publishers I mentioned, and there's no way to determine or tell you what the differences would be. because that's like really like what would it be like to be published at Graywolf or Coffee House or Milkweed, or it'll be different. I don't know necessarily who the editors are or their marketers are, their budgets are.
Well, I can tell you about one place,
Sure.
right? Like, so I think that's right, that it would be very different. Their process is different at every, different kind of house. But in a general sense, right, the reason
And
they
that's the
have
same for
those-
Simon & Schuster and HarperCollins.
Yeah. So, in a general sense, if they are establishing a trade division, then, their perspective on how they're going to sell it and who the audience is. We've been talking.
I think they sell it the
we've
same
been
way.
Talking,
I think they just want it to go to.
I think Harvard University Press is a little different. So, like, Harvard University Press has been hiring editors from the trade presses to do history. So Joy DeMeno was there. She has gone back to Simon & Schuster. Now they have Wendy Wolf, who used to be at Viking. And they're specifically meant to find things for the trade. Now, in terms of the process of acquisition, I don't know if that has changed. With the university presses, there's like the review, right? And I don't think so. That's where it may be.
They are.
Like really, they are still.
Yeah, I mean,
Well, there you go. So I haven't been in that process yet, but maybe the process is still the same. My only
it's the Wild
thinking
West
is,
everywhere.
is just like maybe they're thinking audience-wise they can reach something else, in that sense. Usually it's just money. They just want money, like they want their ceiling
That's
to
what I
be
mean. I
higher.
don't think that there's like I don't
Yeah.
think that's like a thing, like in a formal way, where it's like they work differently. I mean, I'm sure like it's like Yale University Press is in the middle of searching for their new director, and I know that they're trying to like upscale. They don't have a plan.
I mean, I think there are probably some questions that she could ask each of those, like,
Yes.
what were the number, like, what's the distribution like? What are the numbers that are published in general in the series?
I think that's the same for every single publisher, trade, or academic that you have to ask. Simon & Schuster, Norton, Penguin Random House, Yale University Press, you have to ask each of those 5 things the questions that you have about how you're going to be sold. Because each of those 5 places, as different that they are going to do a totally different job from one another. So I think that's just the general business of having to do due diligence with any publisher you're considering entering into business with.
Yeah, they have different business models though, right? Like for instance, St. Martin's Press, right? It's a bit more like throw things out there, right? Like high volume, like less focus. So like you'll find out like a perspective on, like an overall perspective on how they publish.
Right, but then you do like the comics business is different from the literary business inside of Pantheon.
Yeah.
So I have one editor who I've told to do one thing one way, and one editor who I've told to do things totally differently.
Sure,
I've given them different numbers to hit,
Yeah.
different budgets.
Yeah.
So I think that can even be tricky even at St. Martin's, where you have some people who are supposed to bring in the excellent stuff
Right.
and the money, and some people who are supposed to do mysteries.
Right, Jennifer.
And those people have
Enderling's
different
book, too.
jobs.
Yeah. So
So I really do think that it is like literally a hard to answer question. In an annoying way. Like, we should be more standardized.
You have a question, Manuel?
Yeah, there are some questions from online. 3. The first one, what are your thoughts on books covering video games, the industry development process, gamers market, etc., given how incredible large the industry is, larger than all music and television combined? It feels like it doesn't get the books you would expect.
I would like more books about video games myself as a person who plays them. Correct, there aren't enough.
I guess it depends on what kind of books too, right? So like what has been working, I think, is, what is it? Like RPG narratives, right? To some degree. There's a certain kind of book that is working right now, and I have to be honest because I don't do them. Like I'm not totally aware, but like books about the industry, like there are those books out there. The ones that I forgot his name, Tom Bissell, I think.
Oh yeah, Tom Bissell, he was one.
Yeah, like books. So it really depends on what kind of book you're talking about, I think, about video games, or are they games themselves in a certain sense? I can speak to the books about the industry. The books about the industry are tricky sells and the ceilings are fairly low, is what we found. And I think that's true.
But I'd also argue we don't know how to sell to the gaming community at all under any circumstances. There's not a relationship whatsoever. We've never built a single channel into being able to sell to those folks. And therefore, you publish books about video games that are actually quite good, and you don't have a media relationship with any of the people that sell the kids the video games.
I think that's true, but the only thing that I would say about some of this, and going back to audience as well, is there are huge industries, right? And they're just, I think, they're maybe just not book buyers, frankly. I deal with this when it comes to extreme sports, right? Like it's a huge industry of X Games and, motocross or whatever, but I remember that, I think Shaun White, the biggest star at his peak when he was, a two-sport Olympic athlete, you would think this guy has millions and millions of followers on his socials and it's a huge sport and it's getting all this media. But then when you put out a book by him, it's just not commensurate with that enthusiasm in that world. And so I think there's a danger of saying that, hey, there's this huge interested market, but some of those markets just aren't I don't think they're book buyers, frankly.
I'm sorry, Kirby. I think everybody's a book buyer. So you know the book, The 48 Laws of Power? Mm-hmm. Do you know how many people read that book that are considered non-book buyers? It's the right book sold in the right way to the right person. Everybody's a book buyer. Everybody likes to buy stuff. Everybody likes to buy stuff, whether or not they're a book reader.
I don't think so. I talk to my friends who used to read, and I ask them, when's the last time you bought a book? When's the last time you read a novel?
Yeah, what if they're getting a divorce? Then they read Conscious Uncoupling. What if they're getting a this? Then they read that.
Yeah, but they listen to podcasts. They watch YouTube.
So
they go there. They go to their gurus.
Well, then we need new jobs.
But there's a lot of people, and this is why I asked you want to get back in this job. Is this job
I just am not that level.
shrinking.
I will never be that cynical that I think that there are large swaths of the American public who simply cannot be convinced to buy books. Never. That's when I will lay down and die.
That's good. That's good. But it's good to have different opinions about this anyway, right? On one panel.
It's like Harry Potter. Where did all them people come from? They hadn't bought a book in years and years and years, and then all of a sudden they bought Harry Potter. Do you know what I mean? Every time there's a boom and everybody in the whole world reads a book, well, they just don't read books. What happened to them? Where'd they come from? They came crawling out the ditch.
I had a job at the beginning of Call of Duty in the Kindle, where I was editing Kindle singles set in Call of Duty to go with pre-orders of Call of Duty. It was a weird job for a couple series of Call of Duty. And I was like, who is this for? Who is the person who's choosing to buy Call of Duty from Amazon to get a free short story?
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? I was like, what a weird cross promotion. I don't know how they sold, but it was weird. It was a weird thing.
I don't think that you can magically make people start buying books. I think the thing is you have to think about what they will It's like everything that's bought has been marketed.
Yep.
You've been taught to buy every single thing on your body, everything in your house. And it is a failure of imagination to write people off as non-consumers. And that is maybe cynical. But if Apple just said people just aren't computer users and just let their business tank, they would all be fired within hours for even saying it out loud. And I just don't think that we in books think that way. We're so comfortable with obsolescence. And I think that is just a truly dark thing about our business. To really believe that all we can do is sell Colleen Hoover, to really believe it in our business, in our actions, in our hiring practices, in the way that we treat people. Look at America. It's rough, but I just believe better of us.
Can I ask a question, just thinking about academics in the room, about training and maybe incentives? I don't have a PhD, I'm not trained as a scholar, but I'm thinking about how many people in their PhD training are trained to write articles and chapters. Even when you're writing a dissertation as a book, you think about this very chapter way, everybody's working on their chapters. And how rarely that's what you want in a trade nonfiction book, is things that are kind of siloed inside the book this way. And I was just wondering if you'd had experience working with people that transitioning from that sort of more my book is 12 people inside a trench coat to like an actual thing, right? Because I think that in my own friends, watching people try to make the transition from doing academic facing work to public, that's one of the mindsets that seems to takes them like a book and a half. The first book is a book of essays that's cool, and the next book is like a thing you can sell to a trade because it's one big narrative, like as you're talking. I'm just wondering maybe if you can think about how people might train themselves differently, or is there like a way that you help people through that sort of like conceptual framework that you're talking about? We're developing a new project as a nonfiction thing, how to think in sort of like a bigger unit, and I think academics are used to thinking.
I think going back to kind of an earlier conversation we were having about, thinking of story, really. Like thinking of the beats of a story and thinking of, everything needs a beginning, middle, and end, And so sometimes what that means is that certain parts of what you have collected don't make it into the book, potentially. That's what I usually find is if you can get comfortable with letting things go. I mean, there's the old adage, right? Like, kill your darlings, right? And so in service of the story that you're telling, then you can come up with something that is cohesive, that is something that I can pitch to a trade publisher, and that goes for like short story collections too. Like a lot of times what I find is that with short story collections, we'll take a look at like 16 stories and we'll be like, you know what, like these are great, I love these, but they probably don't fit within the way that we want to pitch this story, right? So the more I make a story collection resemble like a novel in terms of its scope and in terms of its setting and certain other elements, the easier it is I can sell it to a publisher, and the more I think it's easier for them to market as well. But that doesn't necessarily, the way that we do that isn't as rigid as you might think. It doesn't have to take place in one place. It doesn't have to be one character. It can be a kind of spirit of the stories, right? And that's what unifies them. So that's kind of what I bring in.
I think also working with an editor, right? Like just like doing more articles. Like if you're trying to learn, like having, like a workshop, you're getting constantly workshopped. If you're an editor, they're constantly getting feedback on shorter things. And it just maybe speeds up the learning because you're actually producing and getting feedback from an editor without having a book edit. It's like, it's really hard to attack.
Yeah.
But in pieces, you learn a lesson every time a different editor edits you. And so whether or not it's not, like that's one of those places where it's not about the money. Do you know what I mean? If you're trying to learn how to write for the trade, it's worth just doing the thing where you're going to have access to an editor helping, because that's going to just speed up your learning big time. But it's hard to, it takes time. I think people want books to be fast when they are slow.
Yeah. Yes. I think also the way we're trained to summarize in criticism as opposed to make scenes in like narrative books, and like that being able to like transition from
Yeah.
I mean, yeah.
It just takes time to learn it. You have to keep doing it. It's like, over and over and over again. I mean, look at some of these writers who've been writing, and it's like they're still learning.
Sure. Okay.
And it's incredible to watch them still learn. So I think it's just like that lifelong learning.
Okay, here's another question from the online attendee. Given the topic of consumer behavior and power, what are your thoughts on secondhand books or library usage? As time goes on, there will be more and more used books to be purchased. So is there an inherent hurdle in terms of grabbing attention?
Libraries are great. Libraries are book purchases. Every book that a library lends has been purchased from the publisher, and money has gone to the author. So I think that one, libraries create access where people wouldn't have it, and you want readership and you want cultural impression. So I think that they're terrific. Used books, I used to, when I was really young, I was like, I don't buy used books by living authors because they don't get any money, and I think that that's unfair. I'd rather people just read.
Yeah.
I think picking up a book and reading one is is attention. I don't know that used bookstores are thriving, so I'm not sure that they're taking away from anything right now. But I think that they're just as important a part of the landscape as anything else.
Yeah, and I think the habit is what we hope to cultivate. And you know, if you're a reader, then you know you will be a consumer at some
Yeah,
point.
you're coming
and
to
you'll
another
be-
book.
Yeah, you're going to do it. So, yeah, it's important.
Okay, with just a few minutes left, so.
There's one more question. How would you speak to publishing through Apple Books or KDP as compared to your process? Is the digital publishing more of a step in building a writing career over your processes?
I no longer speak about independent publishing in public anymore.
I'll speak briefly about it, just real quick. I don't think it's for everyone. I think any of this is about expectations, right? And if what your motivation is to just get it out and to publish and have some people read it, then I think it's fine, you know? I think it's very hard to think of that as a platform upon which to jump to traditional publishing. What we hear about are the people who have incredible success on those platforms, on those independent platforms, and that get traditional deals and that have them. But what you don't hear about is the 99% of people who don't, because it's so hard to get discoverability and to do it in a certain way where you get the number of sales that will get you to a traditional publisher. What I find is that, and if we're talking about, you know, just the business of publishing, is once you put that out there, you get an ISBN number, you get a sales track, and once you have a sales track, now we do the prejudice of saying, well, that's what you sell, you know, that's that hinders you when we get out into the retail market and what they buy. Now they've seen that you have 4 books out there that are self-published that sold 300 copies, 200 copies, what have you, and everybody's expectations of what your next book are going to do are much lower. So I think that is really a risk if what you want to do is end up publishing with Simon & Schuster or Penguin Random House. But if what you want to do is just have something available and you love just writing and you want to get it out there, and you know, then that's right. I think it's really about expectations ultimately.
And people really do love copy editing, proofreading. And that's like a real part of the bookmaking process. And if you're gonna do it, I would just spend the extra money to hire somebody to do that work for you, because it's really bad when there's typos all throughout the independently published books.
Yeah.
All right, well, this was really informative and hopefully motivating. We're all readers. We all love to write. We love the word, and we all have something to say. So hopefully you'll go out there and do it, and you have some wisdom of how to make that happen. So let's thanks.